In January of 1975, a 24-year-old engineer walked into a laboratory in Rochester, New York, and built something that would change how every human being on Earth sees the world. He carried it into a boardroom the following year. He photographed the executives sitting across from him before saying a single word. He showed them the image on a television screen. He told them that in 15 to 20 years, this would replace every camera ever made. They looked at what he had built. They looked at each other, and then they gave him their verdict. 7 words. Those 7 words are the reason that on January 19th, 2012, the most powerful photography company in human history filed for bankruptcy. The reason that 60,000 families in one American city watched everything disappear. The reason that the device in your pocket right now, the one you use to photograph every moment of your life, was invented by a company that decided the best thing to do with it was nothing. This is the story of Kodak. George Eastman was not an inventor by training. He was a bank clerk from Rochester, New York, who in 1878 decided to take a holiday to the Caribbean. A colleague suggested he bring a camera to remember it by. He never made the trip. The photographic equipment of 1878 required a 3x4-foot wooden box, glass plates, chemical tanks, jugs of distilled water, developing tents, and a working knowledge of chemistry. Eastman looked at the pile of equipment and decided the problem was not the holiday. The problem was photography itself. He spent the next 5 years fixing it. By 1883, he had patented roll film. By 1888, he had built the first Kodak camera, a small black box, preloaded with enough film for 100 exposures, sold for $25. When the roll was finished, you mailed the entire camera back to Rochester. Kodak developed the photographs, reloaded the camera, and sent everything back to you. The slogan printed on the box said everything the business needed to say. You press the button, we do the rest. That one sentence was not just an advertisement, it was a business model. Eastman had understood something that very few people in the history of commerce have ever understood as clearly. The money was never in the camera. The money was in everything that came after the camera. Film, chemicals, paper, processing. Every photograph taken on a Kodak camera meant another purchase, then another, then another. It was the razor and blades model before Gillette had invented the razor. Profit margins on film and consumables ran at around 80%. By 1976, Kodak controlled 90% of American film sales and 85% of camera sales. 140,000 people worked for the company worldwide. In Rochester alone, 60,000 families drew their income from Kodak Park. Bonus season in that city was a larger retail event than Christmas. Car dealerships ran advertisements specifically timed for the week Kodak paid its annual bonus. Workers bought cars off the lots in lines. The phrase Kodak moment had entered the English language. By 1996, independent analysts ranked the Kodak brand as the 5th most valuable on Earth. For most of the 20th century, this machine seemed permanent, unbreakable. And then, in 1974, a supervisor handed a young engineer a strange request. His name was Steve Sasson, and he was the wrong kind of engineer for Kodak. Born in 1950 in Brooklyn, New York, Sasson had studied electrical engineering at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, graduating with his master's degree in 1973. That same month, he walked into his first and only job at Kodak's research laboratory in Rochester. The company that hired him was built on chemistry and mechanics. Its laboratories were filled with chemical engineers and mechanical engineers, the people who understood film emulsions, developing agents, and the tolerances of camera shutters. Electrical engineers were not part of the story. Kodak barely hired them. The fact that Sasson was there at all was unusual. In 1974, his supervisor, Gareth Lloyd, gave him an assignment with no defined outcome. A semiconductor company called Fairchild had recently produced something called a charged coupled device, a component that could capture light and convert it into electrical data. Lloyd asked Sasson to evaluate it. No goal was specified, no deadline was set. No one, including Lloyd, had any expectation of what might come next. Sasson spent the following year building something from whatever he could find. The lens came from a Super 8 movie camera. The power source was 16 nickel-cadmium batteries. The analog-to-digital converter was adapted from Motorola components. The memory system was a portable cassette tape recorder, repurposed to store image data. The whole assembly was wired together across 6 circuit boards. The finished device weighed 3.6 kilograms. It was roughly the size and shape of a toaster. Some mornings, Sasson later admitted, he stood in the shower asking himself why he had ever said he could build this thing. He kept building. On December 12, 1975, Sasson and his chief technician Jim Shukla decided the device was ready for its first test. They needed a subject. A laboratory assistant named Joy Marshall agreed to pose. Sasson pointed the camera at her. The shutter fired in 50 milliseconds. Then the machine began its work, writing the captured image to the cassette tape one slow line at a time. 23 seconds passed. The tape was removed, placed into a separate playback unit. Another 23 seconds. Then the image appeared on a television screen. 100 pixels wide, 100 pixels tall, 10,000 pixels in total. A file size of 5 kilobytes. Joy Marshall looked at her own face on the screen. It was a blur of grey static, her features barely visible in the noise. She looked at Sasson. She said, "You need work." Then she left. Sasson reversed a set of wires. The next image was clear. In 1976, he carried the camera into a Kodak boardroom. He said nothing before he used it. He photographed the executives sitting across the table from him, removed the tape, inserted it into the playback unit, and put a black and white image of their own faces on a television screen. That got their attention. Then he told them what it meant, that film, as they knew it, had perhaps 15 to 20 years left. That this device, made smaller and sharper with time, would eventually replace everything Kodak sold. The room was quiet for a moment. Then came the verdict. 7 words, spoken without ceremony. "That's cute. But don't tell anyone about it." The patent was filed. Granted in 1978, no public disclosure followed. Sasson was told to continue his work. He was also told something else that day. Something he would not repeat publicly for 25 years. Here is what makes this particular story different from every other corporate failure you have ever heard. Kodak didn't ignore the future. They saw it clearly and then chose to protect the past anyway. In 1981, Kodak did something that most failing companies never bother to do. They commissioned a study, not a casual internal memo. A formal, structured analysis of what digital photography would do to their business, conducted by people who understood both the technology and the market. The report came back with a clear conclusion. Film had approximately 10 years before digital imaging became commercially viable at a mass scale. 10 years of runway, 10 years to prepare, to pivot, to build the business that would survive what was coming. The boardroom read the report, they understood it, and then they made a choice. Here is the thing that separates Kodak from every other cautionary tale told in business schools. This was not a failure of imagination. The executives were not confused about what digital photography was. Steve Sasson had shown them the prototype in a boardroom 5 years earlier. The internal study had now told them precisely when the threat would arrive. They were not men who had failed to see the future. They were men who had seen it, measured it, dated it, and decided that protecting the present was worth more than building for what came next. The reason was on the income statement. Film was not merely a product at Kodak, it was the engine of everything. In the year 2000, just as the digital transition was accelerating, sales related to film still accounted for 72% of Kodak's total revenue and 66% of its operating income. Any investment in digital photography was, by definition, an investment in destroying the most profitable business the company had ever operated. The executives were not irrational. They were protecting something real. They were also guaranteeing something catastrophic. The clearest expression of this thinking came from a senior executive whose response to Sasson's continued development work has since been documented in research conducted at New York University. When asked whether Sasson should keep developing the digital camera prototype, the executive said, "Yes, continue. And I hope you will fail." Not indifference, not confusion, deliberate suppression, spoken aloud, recorded and preserved. In 1988, CEO Colby Chandler made the largest single bet of this entire story. Instead of redirecting capital toward digital, he spent $5.1 billion acquiring Sterling Drug, a pharmaceutical company. The reasoning had its own logic. Kodak understood chemistry. Drug manufacturing was chemistry. The adjacency felt safe. Ask yourself this: if your core business was being threatened by a technology you had invented and buried, would you spend $5 billion on a pharmaceutical company? Kodak did. Meanwhile, Steve Sasson kept building. In 1989, he produced the world's first digital single-lens reflex camera, the ECAM prototype. 1.2 megapixels. Compressed image storage on memory cards. A portable body that looked and felt like a modern camera. Kodak filed patents on the design. They patented the word Digicam. They did not manufacture it. And here, finally, is what Sasson did not say publicly for 25 years. The thing he was told to keep quiet on the day the 7 words were delivered. The marketing department had reviewed his camera. They had concluded that they could sell it. The technology was viable, the market was reachable, the product was real, and they had chosen not to because selling it would cannibalize film. Could, but wouldn't. 1994, the pharmaceutical gamble collapsed. Sterling Drug was sold off in pieces at a loss of billions. The detour had consumed the 1 decade the 1981 study had told them they had. Time jump now to the summer of 1984, Los Angeles, the Olympic Games. Fujifilm arrived as the official film sponsor. Kodak, the company that had defined photography for a century, had hesitated on the sponsorship. Fujifilm did not hesitate. American consumers saw Fuji branding on every surface of the Games. Film market share began its slow, permanent bleed that day, and it never stopped. By the mid-1990s, Kodak still looked like a giant. Revenue of nearly $16 billion, the 5th most valuable brand on Earth. And somewhere inside the building, the numbers told a different story. On paper, 1996 was the best year in Kodak's history. Revenue of nearly $16 billion. Stock trading above $90 a share. Market capitalization exceeding $31 billion. The Kodak brand ranked 5th most valuable on Earth, sitting alongside Coca-Cola, Microsoft, IBM, and Marlboro. 140,000 people on the payroll. A company so dominant, so embedded in daily life across every continent that its collapse felt not merely unlikely, but structurally impossible. The paper was lying. Below the surface, the ground had already shifted. Digital cameras were now commercially available in consumer electronics stores. Fujifilm was cutting prices on film, squeezing Kodak's margins on the one product that kept everything else alive. The film market share that had stood at 90% in 1976 had already begun its slide. By 1997, it had fallen below 80%. The number looked manageable. It was not manageable. It was a cliff that had no visible bottom. In 1997, Kodak's revenue fell from $15.97 billion to $14.36 billion in a single year, $1.61 billion gone in 12 months. The CEO stood in front of the company and announced the removal of 20,000 jobs, not a restructuring, not a repositioning. 20,000 people told their careers at the most famous photography company in the world were finished. Before we get to the final collapse, there is one number I have not told you yet. A number that, once you hear it, makes everything that follows almost impossible to believe. Hold that thought. It is coming. In 2001, Kodak made a quiet announcement. They told the world that one of their engineers had invented the digital camera back in 1975, 26 years after the fact. The digital world had 800 million websites, a thriving consumer camera market built by Sony and Canon and Nikon, and absolutely no interest in what Kodak had kept in a drawer. They had waited for a moment that was already 2 decades gone. In 2005, Kodak briefly became the #1 seller of digital cameras in the United States, capturing 21% of the market. That same year, the company's own chief executive publicly described digital cameras as a crappy business. He was correct. The margins were gone, the model was broken, and the trap had no exit. Here is the number. In 2010, Kodak earned $838 million from licensing the patents on digital photography it had invented and buried. It was being paid royalties by the industry it had abandoned. $838 million. That is what Kodak earned in the year 2010 from patent licensing. Not from cameras, not from film, not from any product that a single customer chose to buy. From royalties. Canon paid them, Samsung paid them, Apple paid them. Every company that had built a thriving digital photography business on the foundations of technology invented in Rochester, New York, in 1975, sent Kodak a check. The very industry that had destroyed Kodak's film business was legally obligated to fund its final years. The patent on Steve Sasson's original digital camera had been granted in 1978. Over the following 3 decades, that single piece of paper and the thousands of patents that followed it earned the company billions of dollars in licensing revenue. Kodak had invented the future, refused to build it, watched competitors build it instead, and then collected rent on the rubble. 2 years after earning $838 million in patent royalties, Eastman Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The assets on the filing were $5.1 billion. The debts were $6.8 billion. The difference between those two numbers, $1.7 billion, was the final cost of every decision made in every boardroom from 1976 onwards. Now set the legal documents aside, set the balance sheet aside, look instead at what those numbers meant in a single American city. At its peak in 1982, Kodak employed 60,000 people in Rochester, New York. Those 60,000 people paid mortgages, bought cars, raised children, and kept an entire regional economy breathing. Kodak at its height accounted for a quarter of every salary paid in the Rochester metropolitan area. Bonus season was not a corporate event, it was a civic one. Car dealerships ran advertisements timed specifically for Kodak Bonus Week. Appliance stores ordered extra stock. Local newspapers swelled with retail pages. A Kodak bonus could buy a car. Many did. By the early 2000s, Rochester's Kodak workforce had fallen to 1,600 people, 58,400 jobs. Gone. From 2003 to 2011 alone, the company cut 47,000 positions globally, closed 13 manufacturing plants, and shuttered 130 film processing laboratories. The stock that had traded above $90 in 1996 hit 54 cents in September 2011. That is not decline, that is erasure. On January 19, 2012, the date that opened this story, Eastman Kodak filed for bankruptcy protection in a federal court in New York. The company that had taught the world to remember its moments had run out of them. Steve Sasson kept his original prototype in his office for 30 years as he moved through the company, as a reminder, he said, of a fun project. In 2009, Barack Obama placed the National Medal of Technology and Innovation around Steve Sasson's neck at a ceremony in the White House. In 2011, Sasson was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. In 2012, the Royal Photographic Society awarded him its Progress Medal, one of the most prestigious honors in the history of photography. 2012 was also the year his employer filed for bankruptcy. His original prototype, the toaster-sized 3.6 kilogram cassette tape camera that Kodak told him not to talk about, sits today in a permanent exhibition at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. The camera that was locked in a drawer is now behind glass in the most visited museum complex on Earth. Fujifilm faced the identical crisis. Same film business, same collapsing market, same existential threat arriving at the same speed. They made a different choice. They diversified early into cosmetics, into medical imaging, into flat panel display coatings. They treated their chemistry expertise as a platform, not a prison. In 2024, Fujifilm's annual revenue was nearly $20 billion. They are still here. As of August 2025, Kodak, now a company of 3,900 people, warned investors there is substantial doubt about its ability to continue operating. The story is not over. It is just very quiet. This is not a story about technology. It is a story about what happens when the people who build something decide the thing they built is more important than what they could build next. Every photograph on your phone today, every wedding, every birth, every ordinary Tuesday is the direct descendant of what Steve Sasson built in a Rochester laboratory in December 1975. Kodak invented that world. They just never lived in it. If that kind of story is what brought you here, the ones about what was built, what was buried, and what it cost, there is another one waiting for you next. Subscribe so you do not miss it.